Hello, everyone. A good morning, a good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to Teacher Development Webinars. My name is Amanullah Sant. I facilitate virtual programs at Teacher Development Webinars. Teacher Development Webinars is a social action project implemented by British Council Active Citizens in Pakistan as a response to COVID-19 crisis. It is an initiative to support teachers and educators around the world with professional development opportunities. We are thankful to Master English Training for sponsoring a Zoom account. And in our today's webinar, Classroom Research and the Whole Teacher will outline the principles and practice of classroom research and will focus particularly on its potential as a way of doing teacher development. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Alan Pulverness for this webinar. Alan Pulverness has worked as a teacher and teacher trainer in Canada, Germany, Italy, Russia, and the UK. He is a co-director of Transform ELT and a senior consultant for NILE, the Norwich Institute for Language Education. He has been a consultant for the British Council on curriculum renewal, syllabus design, materials development, and reader development projects in Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, Russia, and the UK. He is co-author of a number of course books, including the award-winning Macmillan Short Course Program and the TKT course. His specialist interests are drama and literature in ELT and intercultural awareness. From 2000 to 2004, he edited IR conference lections, and from 2002 from 2002 to 2006, he co-chaired the British Council Oxford Conference on the teaching of literature. Thanks very much, Alan. We are happy to have you. Welcome to Teacher Development Webinars.
Thank you very much, Amanullah. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, wherever you are. I'll just share my screen.
Great. Take us away. While I'm admitting all, you can type in the chat box where are you joining us from.
Okay.
Great.
So without any further ado, I'd like to look first at the distinction between teacher training and teacher development, and then to look a little more closely at what teacher development implies, some of the benefits and the obstacles, how CPD, continuing professional development, might happen, how it does happen, how it could happen. I will recommend the British Council CPD framework and take a closer look at that, and then move to a view of teaching as essentially about decision making, and that will take us into a particular focus on classroom research as one of the most productive options for practicing teachers to take responsibility for their own development.
Hello, everyone. For the housekeeping, I would like everyone to mute their mics. Please mute your mics for the housekeeping. Go on, Alan. You can unmute now.
Teacher training or teacher development. Let's look at both of those. Okay. Teacher training is normally something that is imposed on teachers. It's a compulsory part of your preparation to become a teacher or to continue teaching. Whereas teacher development is something that comes from the bottom up. It's something that teachers do for themselves. Right. Teacher training tends to be about acquiring a set of predetermined competencies, the kind of things that are checklisted on observation sheets. If you've been in a position on a teacher training course of teaching observed and assessed lessons, you'll probably see the assessor sitting in the corner, literally ticking boxes to confirm that you have demonstrated a particular set of skills and procedures which are set down in the syllabus for the training course. Teacher development has a much broader scope. It's about developing not just a set of skills, but a set of capacities to be ready for the unexpected, rather than training to perform the expected. Teacher training tends to be short-term, time-bound courses, whereas teacher development is lifelong, career-long. You can say you've been trained, but I don't think you can say you've been developed in quite the same sense. Teacher training is a one-off event. Teacher development is ongoing. CPD is continuing professional development. Teacher training, therefore, is temporary, whereas teacher development, as we've said, continual. Teacher training is directed by an external agenda. It's not something the teacher decides for herself or himself. Teacher development comes from an internal agenda. The teachers themselves identifying their own needs and taking appropriate action. Training has to do with developing observable and definable skills and techniques. Not unimportant. It's part of every teacher's competence to acquire new ways of doing things. But teacher development has more to do with a broader awareness of, in our case, language, of learners, of methods as well, but not just how to do things, but why and who for. Teacher training then is top down, development bottom up. Training leads towards a defined and definable product. Development is more concerned with process than with product. Training is done with so-called experts, teacher trainers. Development is done with colleagues, with peers. Training in the first instance is undertaken to get a job. Development to stay interested in your job, to stay motivated and committed. So, training or education? Training prepares you against surprise. Education prepares you for surprise. Training sets out a program of classroom scenarios and teaches you what to do in those situations. Education prepares you to be able to cope, be able to respond, be able to react to whatever happens in the classroom, which may not be what your training has prepared you for. Training sees the past as finished, education as unfinished. Training repeats that completed past in the future. This is what we know about teaching and learning, and we expect you to follow the same path in the future. Education, seeing the past as unfinished, as always unfinished, continues that unfinished past into the future. Training leads towards a profile, a final definition of yourself as a teacher. Education towards continuing self-discovery. We talk about lifelong learning, and teachers should be lifelong learners. You never stop learning about teaching. Recently, I've been doing a lot of work in Algeria with school inspectors, and I know from the very active exchanges on Facebook in various groups that whole community of inspectors and teachers throughout the country are constantly questioning, asking each other, asking themselves questions that don't have finished answers, but which they go on examining and thinking about. We can replace the word education with the word development. And the words on this slide are actually taken from a book not about teaching and teacher training at all, but one of those kind of popular psychology books which I picked up called Finite and Infinite Games. Quite an interesting book to read, and these reflections on the difference between training and education jumped off the page when I read them, and I immediately thought of development fitting in there in place of education. So what is teacher development? It's been defined variously, and it's all the definitions of teacher development are always quite extensive, quite comprehensive. It includes so much. There isn't a syllabus for teacher development. It's very wide, very inclusive. It's about growth, certainly, about learning from experience and looking systematically. And the reason I've highlighted those words will become clear when we move on to talk about classroom research. So the key words here are experience, examination, looking objectively and rigorously at your own experience, and doing so in a systematic way. In practice, it can include all sorts of things, any kind and every kind of professional activity. You're doing development, teacher development, when you go to conferences, when you attend webinars such as this one, workshops, professional meetings of local teachers associations, when you're mentoring a new colleague, all of those rather formal activities, but also informal experiences, picking up a teacher's journal, a teacher's magazine, even watching TV programs related to an academic discipline. That can all fall under the heading of teacher development. It's always a good idea to clear the air first and acknowledge the obstacles before you go on to talk about the benefits. So, time, always the enemy of teachers. And perhaps one of the first reactions, maybe your first reaction, would be to say, well, you know, I teach 30 hours a week. I have piles of students' work to mark. I have to attend school meetings. I haven't got time for anything extra. Geographical distance, it may be problematic if you're living in a remote area. It may be difficult for you to get together with colleagues. And of course, we've learned this year that there are ways of overcoming that sort of obstacle. Contractual constraints, there may be limitations in your terms of employment that prevent you from undertaking certain kinds of professional development activities. There may be very real financial constraints that limit what you're able to do in addition to your normal work as a teacher. Resources, of course, are always it's always challenging, and so there are a number of everyday physical and resource constraints that might inhibit you and make it easier not to worry, not to think about this, but just get on with your job. And then I think the way that teachers perceive the idea of professional development may also be an inhibiting factor. I remember when I worked in a school some years ago, and one of the senior management came along to one of our teachers' meetings and told us about how the school was introducing a system of professional development, and he told us how that was designed to happen. And of course, our response was not very positive. Having someone come along and tell us how to develop professionally. Teacher development at its best comes from within. It comes from within the individual teacher or groups of, at its best, groups of teachers. It may need guiding. It may need mentoring. It may need support, but it's not something that's easily imposed from academic management. So it's a very delicate balance. If you're in a position where you have some responsibility for teachers' professional lives, if you're the director of, if you're the head of a department, if you're a senior teacher, if you're the director of a school, you may have a lot of sympathy with some of the things I'm saying, but you have to be, it's a very delicate thing to enlist teachers' energy and commitment and enthusiasm to do this for themselves. So your role is to coax and inspire rather than impose a model. That's really counter to the spirit, the ethos of teacher development. So moving on from the obstacles to the benefits, for the individual teacher, it leads to doing what you do better, improving your performance, a very rewarding sense of getting more out of your job, professional satisfaction, an informal support system that can and should go on for your whole career, greater motivation for doing what you do, and greater reward, greater professional satisfaction. For the institution, the benefits are also clear. Quality goes up. There's a growth in the learning culture. We talk sometimes about schools as learning institutions, not just a place where students learn or pupils learn, but a place that grows, where everybody involved, academic managers, school leaders, school principals, teachers, teacher trainers, students, parents, are all part of a learning process. So that's what I mean by learning culture, an institution that grows. So it's not just about the individual, but how those processes of individual growth contribute to a whole school learning and improving. It encourages innovation because it makes people think creatively and imaginatively about what they're doing. And it helps the school to form its development plans and new policies. And there's a symbiotic relationship between the two. The benefits for teachers are felt by the institution, and at the same time, the institutional progress has a positive influence on teachers. So it's a win-win situation. Everybody benefits. So how does it actually happen? It may happen individually. It may happen, as it has been for so many people this year, in the isolation of your room, online. And we hope we'll all be returning to times when it happens amongst groups of colleagues. It can take many forms. It may be a matter of a regular period of personal reflection, just thinking, and of course all teachers think about their teaching, and you come out of a lesson and you immediately evaluate it in your head and make a mental note of things to do differently or things to do better. But this is, it's going back to that word systematically. It's making a time, carving out a time for yourself every day to do some more concentrated reflection, perhaps making notes in a personal journal and listing particular action points. You may get together with a colleague and agree to try out a new idea in the classroom, try it out for a specified time, get together once a week and discuss how you're getting on, how that idea is progressing. Or getting together with a group of colleagues, again, quite informally, say once a month as a kind of professional reading group. I think the idea of I was at a reading group myself online last night, not a professional one. We were talking about a novel, and it's an activity that's probably that I know certainly in the UK has become even more popular this year because of the circumstances. And so I think many people are familiar with the routine of a book club or a reading group. And this is borrowing that idea for English language teachers, getting together to talk about a book or an article that everybody's agreed to read. It doesn't have to be the same text. One group I belong to, we agree on an author or a theme. This is back to literature. And we all bring something different to the group. So it's like one of those parties where everybody brings a plate, brings a different dish. And people in those meetings bring the experience of having read a different article or a different chapter, a different story. So that's another way of organizing those groups. A group might meet on a regular basis to talk about problems, to talk about difficult issues in the classroom, perhaps issues of behavior and discipline, perhaps questions of methodology, particularly tricky subjects in the curriculum. The idea here, though, is that it's problem-based, that it's a kind of support group or mutual self-help group. Going outside the classroom, taking a course on something that has nothing to do with English language teaching, but which puts you in the shoes of a learner, something you may not have done for a long time. And I think sometimes English language teaching can become, can develop a sort of tunnel vision, and we concentrate too much on our own subject and forgetting what we can learn from other fields of training and education. So sometimes taking a step outside of your comfort zone or your familiar surroundings and becoming a learner in a different subject can give you insights into teaching and learning, being a student, being a learner, which you can then bring back to the English language classroom. Teacher training, I've sort of put on one side in distinction from teacher development, but of course, teacher training can come under the wide umbrella of teacher development. So one aspect of teacher development might actually be undertaking some training, some further training. Reviewing a book for a teacher's journal, setting up a small scale classroom research project and reporting on it at the next opportunity, local or national, or maybe even international teachers conference. Then at the bottom of that slide, I don't know if you can see it, there's I, J, K, and L, and they're all dotted lines. The implication being that this is not by any means an exhaustive list. It's an open list. And if we had more time, I'd be asking you for suggestions. Perhaps you can put some suggestions to extend this list in the chat box. Excuse me. I mentioned at the beginning the British Council CPD framework. It looks quite complex, and it's, I think, a very interesting way of representing the key competencies that go to make up your skill and your professional ability as a teacher. So if you look around the outside, you can see all of the individual areas that are part of what it means in the 21st century to be an English language teacher. And if you journey in on the right-hand side where there's a break in the circle, you can see the levels that go from awareness in the external circle to integration as you move towards the center. I'll give you a link for this at the end of the presentation so you can investigate the entire framework in more detail. But just to go a little deeper into it, you can see the stages of development from, do you remember from the, from the outer circle to the inner: awareness, understanding, engagement, integration. So you progress from a stage of having heard about a particular practice to understanding more about it, understanding why it's important, being able to demonstrate your ability to integrate, to implement this practice, and then moving on to a high level of competence. If we take the journey, the professional career path of a teacher, it suggests an initial level of a starting teacher, a novice teacher, a newly qualified teacher, often a so-called probationary period at the beginning of a teacher's career, moving on to an accumulation of experience, developing skills over time and becoming proficient. And the important thing to notice here is those double arrows to the left and to the right. You can see them kind of pointing in both directions. And this makes the point graphically that this isn't a simple progression of steps getting better and better across the board. Our competencies fluctuate. If you think of yourself as a user of English or of any other language, you'll know that there are times when you're an expert, and there are times when you feel you're intermediate or perhaps even elementary, because of the situation, because of the topic, your knowledge of what's being talked about. You can fluctuate in your level of competence in a language. And in the same way as teachers, I think there are moments when we are experts, when we're highly proficient, and there are other moments when we feel perhaps like beginners, or at least newly qualified. And we're constantly adding to our repertoire and trying out new things. And when you try out new things for the first time, you feel initially de-skilled or unskilled, and at other moments far more proficient. And this leads on to an advanced or specialist stage. We can see this applied with an example, just taking planning lessons and courses, which was one of those core competencies around the outside of our circle. And you can see the growth in competence and confidence as you move from left to right in this table. And you can see the developing skill of the teacher as planner and designer of lessons. A table like this, a grid like this, enables the teacher to track their own progress, to look at your teaching, to evaluate yourself in those various core competencies, and decide where you are on the scale. And for any of us, for all of us, I'm sure that we would have ticks or crosses at different points in the vertical for different classroom skills and competencies. So we would all end up with a very spiky profile, a very uneven profile. We would be highly proficient in some teaching skills, perhaps developing in others, and maybe starting in others. This year, a lot of people have had to start teaching online, and probably gradually moving up the scale. So the framework is a tool, it's an instrument to profile yourself as a teacher, and analyze where you are in your professional path, and where you need to develop. Teaching as decision making. And here I'm going to quote briefly from a novel by William Golding, who's most famous for a book called The Lord of the Flies. This book was called Free Fall, and it's narrated by an artist, a famous artist, who has the feeling that somewhere in his life he's lost his freedom, his ability to choose. And he opens the book asking himself, where did he lose his freedom? He talks about the mechanics of cause and effect, and then says, free will cannot be debated, but only experienced, like a color or the taste of potatoes. And he remembers a moment as a very young child when he was in a park, a public park, sitting by a fountain with pathways radiating from the fountain in many different directions. And he remembers having a very strong feeling of being able to take any of those paths. I could take whichever I would. There was nothing to draw me down one more than the other. I danced down one for joy in the taste of potatoes. I was free. I had chosen. And he feels he's lost that feeling somewhere in his life. And the rest of the book is a reflection on his life, trying to identify the moment or the incident where he lost his freedom. And he says, over the years, freedom has become more and more precious to me as I taste the potato less and less often. I've used this metaphor because where he talks earlier, where he talks earlier about the mechanics of cause and effect, and he opposes that to this feeling of freedom. It made me think about my experience as a teacher, being trained initially in the mechanics of cause and effect. If I do this, then the students will do that. If I ask this sort of question, I should get this sort of answer. A very mechanical approach to what I was going to do in the classroom. And increasingly over the years, I don't feel that I've lost my freedom as a teacher, but I've become more and more convinced that teaching is decision making, that in any given lesson there are 1,000 different moments of decision making. Shall I stop this activity now? Shall I answer this question, or tell the student that I'll come back to it later? Shall I group these students together or let them do it by themselves? Shall I stop this activity and move on to the next? All of those tiny decisions that determine the quality of a teaching and learning experience in a single lesson. And I think that textbooks, exams, syllabus constraints, all of our training pushes us in very defined directions. And teachers, as teachers, we all need to rediscover that joy in the taste of potatoes, that freedom to make decisions without feeling that they're being made for us. So, classroom research. Classroom research is the most powerful way of discovering our capacities and our potential as teachers. It's something that teachers can do for themselves, but it benefits from the support of others, from the support of colleagues. So classroom research often happens in collaboration with colleagues. It's by finding out about what happens in our own classrooms that we can improve the quality of our teaching and the quality of what goes on in the school. It can be represented as a kind of flow chart. It starts by problematizing, and that's a tricky word to use because it doesn't mean that it's only about problems. Perhaps questioning would be a better word. You identify some aspect of your teaching that you want to improve, you want to do differently, something that isn't working as well as you feel it could, something that is worth looking at, is worth considering. You undertake some data collection, some information gathering. That's the reconnaissance or fact finding. You make a plan of action. You try it out. You see how it goes. And then you go back to your plan and revise it in the light of your experience. And those 3 dots in the last box at the bottom are very important because they imply that this isn't a closed action. It's something that is iterative. It's a learning cycle. It comes from the practice of action research. And when we talk about classroom research, it's really referring to the principles of action research. So if you want to learn more about it, action research might be the key phrase, to the key term to search, to put in the search box. Action research is probably more closely defined, and I think most there's an increasing preference for the term classroom research now, to locate it in the classroom, but it certainly comes from the principles and frameworks of action research. praxis rather than practice, informed and committed action, informed because you take other people's views into account, committed and intentional because it's rationalized and based on solid principles. It's knowledge. It produces knowledge that comes out of practice and is about practice. So it's not anything abstract. It's knowledge that comes out of what you do in the classroom. The idea of action research comes from a social psychologist in the 1940s called Kurt Lewin, and he described it like this: a process of analysis, fact-finding, conceptualization, planning, execution, more fact-finding or evaluation. So that's when you've undertaken your action and you look at the results, and then a repetition of this whole circle of activities, indeed a spiral of such circles. So that's the iterative process. You don't just do it once, you try, you make a little change, you look at the effects of that change, you reevaluate, and you go back with a slightly revised action. So it might look something like this. So one of those charts where if the problem is, if the action is satisfactory, then you might stop. If there are still adjustments to be made, then you repeat the cycle. This is another representation of it. And this one I particularly like because it includes notes from a teacher. So here was a science teacher faced with the problem of students' attitudes to science subjects. They think that it's just a matter of learning facts, and she wants them to ask questions, to find out what interests them, and to encourage a spirit of inquiry and a questioning approach to science subjects. And you can see how she fits her inquiry into this research cycle. Action research is not, it's not something different. It's not something outside of what teachers do. It's making conscious and making explicit what good teachers naturally do. So it's raising to a conscious level what good teachers do intuitively. It's about practical concerns and practical solutions to problematic situations. And remember, problematic isn't necessarily a negative term. Problem in the sense of question or issue. About the again, that keyword systematic study by groups, by means of reflection on the effects of their actions. Again, the emphasis on groups of people learning from their own experience. And this perhaps is the most concrete definition or description: trying out an idea in practice with a view to improving or changing something, trying to have a real effect on the situation. And I think of all the definitions, this one sums it up in the most concrete and useful way. So just a reminder of that flow, an initial idea, information gathering, planning, taking action, evaluating that action, returning to and revising your plan, taking the next step on the basis of your revised plan. 3 necessary conditions for successful classroom research. 1, viability. And the message here is don't tackle issues you can't do anything about. Don't try to change the whole school culture. It should be something that you have control over, something that you're able to change, not something that is outside, beyond the bounds of what you can change. You can't change the curriculum, but you can change what happens in your classroom. The second principle is discreteness, and this is a very practical consideration. Only take on small scale and quite limited projects. So a good example would be, I want to improve the quality of the questions that I ask in reading lessons, text-based lessons, is a better issue for classroom research than I want to improve my students' reading skills, which is far too big. So it's a good principle in research in general, and classroom research follows the same principle. The projects that you take on should be achievable, manageable, practical, limited. And the third principle is make it something that you're interested in, something that's important to you and your students, or something you have to be involved with anyway. Most teachers at some point have to prepare students for exams. It may not be the lesson, the kind of lesson that you enjoy most, but it's something that you have to do. And so that would fulfill the principle of intrinsic interest. Collecting data can be through field notes, notes that you keep yourself about classes as soon as you can after the class, your own diary or journal, audio recording or video recording, much easier to do that unobtrusively these days with smartphones. And of course, you need your students' permission. They need to know that you might be doing that and that they need to be happy with that. Getting learners to keep diaries, interviews, questionnaires. Sociometry is keeping track on in a graphic way of who does what in the classroom, of which students initiate questions, of which students interact with each other, of students' activities, students' responsiveness. So it's kind of mapping social activity in the classroom. Still photographs can sometimes show you the progress of an activity. Documentary evidence, case studies, students' work, and observation. It may not be practical or part of your own school culture for teachers to go into each other's classes and do that kind of peer observation. You could, if that is the case, you can give students the role of observers and ask them to act as data gatherers, because an observer can always see more of what's going on in the classroom than the teacher themselves. But, and these may be some of the, I'm trying to anticipate your objections. Isn't this just what good teachers do all the time? Yes, it is, but not systematically. And the system of the systematic nature of classroom research is something that makes it more objective, more professional, more reliable, rather than just that kind of informal reflection that we all do. Isn't it wrong to call it research? It has all the characteristics of research, research questions, research methods, evaluation, results. It's just not based in the library, it's based in practice in the classroom. So it is a kind of research, but it's participant based rather than academic. How can you generalize from a unique experience? Well, you can't. The results of classroom research are results for that classroom and for that teacher. There may be, and I'm sure there are, things to be learnt by colleagues from your experience, but it is something that teachers do for themselves. What about properly validated test results? Tests are a reality. Test results are an important indicator of student achievement, and they may contribute to your data. But classroom research is probably more often about quality of learning and progress than it is about quantity of results. It lacks any kind of objectivity. Well, I think if you have a principle of triangulation, of not relying on one source of data, of combining, say, the teacher's field notes, a questionnaire to students, interviews and observation, then you've got different perspectives producing a more objective view. There are two ways of looking at change in teaching. One is where you start with theory, and on the basis of that theory, you do things. So reflection produces action, and understanding is a basis for changing your teaching, which is the way we've all learned to teach. We've started with theories, we've started with courses on education, and we've proceeded to putting them into action. Classroom research turns that model on its head, where action comes first and theory is born, is produced out of action. So the decision to adopt a change of strategy comes before the understanding. So it's the same elements, but in traditional teacher training, first you understand and then you act. Classroom research for practicing teachers, first you act and then you learn. So there's a paper that was published some years ago, which the title of which has always stuck with me. It was called Theorizing from the Classroom. And that's the idea here. And just to finish, two quotations. This is from a Peruvian teacher. And she says simply that classroom research is teacher development made explicit. And this is my favorite quote of all. Classroom research liberates teachers from their prejudices and allows their instincts to blossom. And I particularly like this one because it's from a headmaster. Okay, I realize that I've eaten up the hour. I don't know, Amanullah, if we're able to continue for a few minutes with Q&A. I'm
Yep,
very
sure.
happy.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, sure, we can. So, thanks, Alan, for this enlightening and educating presentation. We thoroughly enjoyed it, and so many great and new ideas for me as well. You can go on, with your presentation. Yep.
So these are the links for the British Council's CPD framework. Cambridge English have a similar framework. I'll come back to that in a moment. And I could have given you a long bibliography, but I've chosen 3 books. Hopkins' book, which, as you can see, has gone into 5 editions, is the most practical. It's not restricted to English language teaching. It's produced by the Open University in the UK, and it's for all teachers of all subjects. And it's really a handbook on how to do classroom research. There's a lot written about action research, but I think Jean McNiff is one of the leading authors in the field, and her last book, 2017, Action Research, All You Need to Know, lives up to its title. And if you want a view, an approach that's particularly for language teachers, then Mike Wallace with CUP in 97, Action Research for Language Teachers. So that's my top 3 books. And I realize that these links are far too long for you to write down. But if you just search British Council CPD framework or Cambridge English Teacher English Teaching Framework, you'll find them. Okay, Amanullah, have you got some questions that you'd like to pass on? Because I haven't been able to look at the chat box until
Yeah,
now.
so the floor is open for questions now. If you have got any questions, you are more than welcome to share in the chat box. I'll be monitoring this chat box. And let me see, there were some questions. Well, first of all, there was a question: how do you motivate teachers to go for CPD? Because oftentimes we lack this intrinsic motivation. And the first question I ask, I listen, is, are we going to get a certificate for this, or this kind of thing? So how do you motivate them?
It's the big question, isn't it? I think it needs to be a gradual process of encouragement, of quite a gentle approach. I think the thing to avoid is that experience that I had as a teacher of a director of training coming along to the school, because it was part of a chain of schools, and telling us how we were going to do CPD. And I think that kind of approach is likely to won't get a very isn't a good way to motivate teachers. So I think it's got to be a gradual approach, getting teachers to, I mean, I assume that the person asking is a school inspector or a head of department or an academic manager, and if you're in that kind of position, I think it would be the wrong spirit to try to impose this. It needs to be a fairly subtle approach, perhaps getting teachers together in a very open kind of discussion group to talk about the issues that concern them, to invite them to suggest ways of improving what they do, developing what they do. Yeah, to maybe you have to choose your words quite carefully, talking about development rather than improvement, because improvement implies that there's something wrong. And it's much more a way of creating a spirit of professional curiosity, professional inquiry. And I think that has to be done by suggestion rather than dictation. I mean, rather than by dictating it.
Yeah, I
Sorry,
completely agree. And there's another question. How effective are CPD models that are created in the center where classes are small and ICT tools are available?
Sorry, can you repeat the question, Amanullah?
How effective are CPD models that are created in the center where classes are small and ICT tools are available?
Okay, I think the model the model is a conceptual one. It doesn't depend on technology or class size. It's more to do with a principle or a set of principles about reflective practice, about being prepared about finding the value of examining the way that you do things. And that can apply, you know, if you're teaching in the lowest resource situation, in very, you know, under-resourced parts of the world or parts of your country. It's working with what you've got. So, you know, I've been in classrooms in China with 60 or 70 students with no technology, but with curious teachers using the resources that they have. And, you know, there are teachers all over the world in all sorts of challenging circumstances who work with what they've got, work with the available resources. So I don't think that CPD is dependent on privileged teaching environments. I think the principles would apply in any classroom anywhere. It's a matter of cultivating that attitude of professional curiosity.
Okay, so there's another question. What is the role of learners in this, action research process?
Very, very important one. I think learners ought to be brought into the circle. They shouldn't be the subjects of experiments. You know, like you have laboratory animals as the subject of an experiment. I think learners should be encouraged as far as possible to be partners in the process or collaborators. I think one of the problems for us as a profession is that we become too concerned with teaching us techniques, with thinking about how we do things as teachers, um, and the effect on learners, rather than bringing learners into the circle of inquiry and experiment. So I think, you know, as far as possible, learners should be engaged in a kind of partnership of inquiry. Anything else, Samanullah?
Yeah, here on Facebook, someone asks if being an educator is to teach a body of knowledge, who is that educator and now if he is already tired and stressed?
I'm not sure I've got. Can you repeat that?
It's about this much stress and tiredness in this area and then managing to do this CPD and, action research.
So as I understand it, the question is about pressure of work
Yep.
and time constraints and seeing CPD as yet another pressure on top of many other pressures. Yeah. I mean, that's something I referred to at the beginning of this talk, and I understand that's very often the way that teachers might feel about it, and I think this brings us back to it circles back to the first question about how you engage teachers, how you motivate them with the idea of a CPD approach. And part of that initiative, if you're introducing teachers to the idea of self-development, is to persuade them that this is something that's worth doing, because it will be liberating. It will actually, it won't lighten their load, but the effort of doing it will have a positive effect on their professional activity, on their professional lives, that they will gain from doing it. They will gain more satisfaction. They will find their work more rewarding if they're consciously engaged in investigating it and modifying it. It puts teachers in more control of their own life and work, of their own professional lives. So I appreciate that it's hard to sell this to teachers who say, oh no, not one more thing that I have to worry about. But it is a matter of selling the idea as something that it needn't involve a lot of extra work. It involves just a switch, a different way of thinking about what you're doing. It's asking them to think. It comes back to that word systematically, in a systematic way about their work, and finding ways. It's a way of not being a robot teacher. It's not being an automatic teacher, of being a more conscious teacher. And it may involve a little investment of time. I can't pretend that it doesn't, but the key is to convince them that it's a worthwhile investment, that it will really pay off, that it's worth a little bit of extra time to keep the records, to make the journal entries, to do the observation, because it will make their teaching lives so much richer as a result.
And then if we can, take this maybe last question, and it says, how do you measure this? What is the successfulness criteria for action research? How do you measure it?
What are the success criteria?
Yep.
It's always improved quality of teaching and learning in the classroom. That's what all of our activity, all of our effort is about. How you measure that. Do you remember I had that imagined question, what about properly validated test results? Test results are one way, but only one way. I would also want something more qualitative. I would want testimony from learners. I'd be very interested, after making some changes in the way I was teaching, after a period of time, in getting feedback from the learners. If getting them to compare the classes that they're doing now with the classes that we were doing 3 months ago, and telling me how they have responded. So I think there are all kinds of success criteria, but they may not always be quantifiable. It may be more to do with quality of response as much as the objective test results. But I think both have a part to play. I wouldn't want it to be measured only in test results.
Great. Thanks very much, Alan. It was pleasure and privilege to have you here with teacher development webinars. We really appreciate your presence. And thanks very much, everyone, for your participation and, for these great ideas. So, yeah, this recording will be made available later this evening on teacher development webinars YouTube channel, so you can watch if you have missed some part of this webinar, and you can follow social media channels for future webinars. And at this point, I will remind you that COVID-19 cases has been on rise. We are seeing this second wave of COVID-19. So please be responsible for your lives and your family's lives, your beloved lives. So yeah, please practice physical distancing, keep wearing masks, and don't forget social solidarity. Thanks everyone. I'll take your leave. So I'm gonna stop this live stream. Be safe everyone. Bye bye. Thanks very much.